Hi everyone again. We are on to part 2 of Under Western Eyes. So let's continue. Women and religious ideologies. A further example of the use of women as a category of analysis is found in cross-cultural analyses which subscribe to certain economic reductionism in describing the relationship between the economy and factors such as politics and ideology. Here, in reducing the level of comparison of economic relations between developed and developing countries, any specificity to the question of women is denied. Myrna Modera's, in a careful analysis of women and Shiism in Iran, focuses on this problem when she critiques feminist writings which treat Islam as an ideology separate from and outside social relations and practices, rather than a discourse which includes rules for economic, social, and power relations within society. Patricia Jeffrey's otherwise excellent works on Pesada women in Purdue considers Islamic ideology as a partial explanation for the status of women, in that it provides a justification for the purdah. Here, Islamic ideology is reduced to a set of ideas whose internalization by Pesada women contributes to the stability of the system. However, the primary explanation for purdah is located in the control that Pesada men have over economic resources and the personal security purdah gives to women by taking a specific version of Islam as the Islam. Jeffrey attributes a singularity and coherence to it. Modera's notes Islamic theology then becomes imposed on a separate and given entity called women. A further unification is reached. Women, meaning all women, regardless of their differing positions within societies, come to be affected or not affected by Islam. These conceptions provide the right ingredient for an unproblematic possibility of a cross-cultural study of women. A number of cross-cultural studies of women's positions which subscribe to this reductionism do by collapsing all ideological specificities into economic relations and universalizing on the basis of this comparison. Women and the development process. The best examples of universalization on the basis of economic reductionism are found in the women in development literature. Proponents of this school seek to examine the effect of development on third world women, sometimes from feminist perspectives. At the very least, there is an evident interest and commitment to improving the lives of women in developing countries. Scholars like Irene Tinker, Esther Busserup, and Perdita Huston have all written about the effects of development policies on women in the third world. All three women assume that development is synonymous with economic development or economic progress. As is the case in the case of Mintz's patriarchal family, Hoskin's male sexual control, and Cutruffelli's Western colonization, development here becomes an all-time equalizer. Women are affected positively or negatively by economic development policies. Cross-cultural comparisons between women in different developing countries is made possible and unproblematic by this assumption of women as a group affected or not by economic policies. For instance, Perdita Huston states that the purpose of her study is to describe the effect of the development process on a family unit and individual members in Egypt, Kenya, Sudan, Tunisia, Sri Lanka, and Mexico. She states that the problems and needs expressed by rural and urban women in these countries center around education and training, work and wages, access to health, other services, political participation, and legal rights. Houston relates all these needs to the lack of sensitive development policies, which exclude women as a group or category. For her, the solution is simple. Improve development policies, which emphasizes training for women field workers, use women trainees, women rural development offers, encourages women's cooperatives, etc. Here again, women are assumed to be a coherent group or category prior to their entry into the development process. Houston assumes that all third world women have similar problems and needs. Thus, they must have similar interests and goals. However, the interests of urban, middle-class Egyptian housewives, for an instance, could surely not be seen as being the same as those uneducated poor maids. Development policies do not affect both groups of women in the same way. Practices which characterize women's status and the roles vary according to class. Women are constituted as women in other ideological institutions and frameworks. They're not women or a coherent group solely on the basis of an economic system or policy. Such reductive cross-cultural comparisons result in the colonization of conflicts and contradictions which characterize women of different classes, cultures, and in addition, sexualities, ethnicities, genders. Thus, according to Perdita Houston, women in third world countries she writes about have needs and problems, but few have choice or freedom to act. This is an interesting representation of women in the third world, one which is significant in suggesting a latent self-presentation of Western women which bears looking at. She writes, "What surprised and moved me most as I listened to women in very different cultural contexts was the commonality, whether educated or illiterate, urban or rural, of their most basic values, the importance they assign to family, dignity, and service to others. I wonder if Houston would consider such values unusual for women in the West." What is problematic then about this analysis that uses women as a group, a stable category, is that it assumes an ahistorical universal unity between women based on a generalized notion of their subordination. Instead of analytically demonstrating the production of women as an economic and social political group within local contexts, the move limits the definition of the female subject to gender, completely bypassing social class and ethnic identities. What characterizes women as a group is their gender, sociological, not biological, over and above everything else, indicating a monolithic notion of sexual difference. Because women are thus constituted as a coherent group, sexual difference is codeterminate with female subordination, and power is automatically defined in binary terms. People who have it and people who don't. Men exploit, women are exploited. As suggested above, such simplistic formulations are both reductive and ineffectual in designing strategies to combat oppressions. All they do is reinforce binary divisions between men and women. What would an analysis which did not look like this look like? Maria Mee's work is an example. It's an example which illustrates the strength of some Western feminist work on women, which does not fall into the traps discussed above. Maria's study of lace makers of Narsapur, India, attempts to carefully analyse a substantial household industry in which housewives produce lace doilies for consumption on the world market. Through a detailed analysis of the structure of the lace, production and reproduction relations, the sexual division of labours, profits and exploitation, the overall consequences of defining women as non-working housewives and their work as leisure time activity, Mies demonstrates the level of exploitation in the industry and the impact of this system on the work and condition of the women involved in it. In addition, she's able to analyse the ideology of the housewife, the notion of a woman in the house providing subjective and social cultural elements of the creation and maintenance of a production system that contributes to increased pauperization of women and keeps them atomized and disorganized as workers. Mies' analysis shows the effect of certain historical and cultural specific modes of organization. An organization constructed on the basis of the definition of lace makers as non-working housewives at familial, local, regional, statewide and international levels. The intricacies and the effects of these power networks are emphasized, and they form the basis of the analysis of how this particular group of women is situated at the center of a hegemonic, exploitative world market. This is a good example of what careful, politically focused local analyses can accomplish. It illustrates how category of women is constructed in a variety of political contexts that exist simultaneously and overlaid on top of one another. There's no generalization of women in India or women in the third world, nor there is a reduction of the political construction of the exploitation of the lace makers to cultural explanations about the passivity or obedience that might characterize women or their situation. It is a mode of logical political analyses which generates theoretical categories from within the situation, and the context being analysed suggests corresponding effective strategies for organising against exploitation faced by the lace makers. These Narsipur women are not victims of production processes because they resist, challenge and subvert the process at various junctures. Here is one instance of how Mizak delineates the connections between the housewife ideology, the self-consciousness of the lace makers, and their interrelationships as contributing to the latent resistance she perceives amongst women. The persistence of the housewife ideology, the self-perception of lace makers as petty commodity reproducers rather than as workers, is not upheld by the structure of the industry as such, by the deliberate propagation and reinforcement of reactionary patriarchal norms and institutions. Thus, most of the lace makers voiced the same opinion about the rules of purdah and seclusion in their communities, which were propagated by the lace exporters. In particular, Kapur women said that they had never gone out of their homes, that women in their community could not do work other than housework and lace work. But in spite of that, some of them still subscribed to patriarchal norms of Gosha women. There was also contradictory elements in their consciousness. Although they looked down with contempt upon women who were able to work outside of the house, like untouchable mullahs and Madhugad women, or women of other lower caste, they could not ignore the fact that these women were earning more money, precisely because they were not respectable housewives, but workers. At one discussion, they even admitted that it could be better if they could go outside and do coolie work. And when they were asked whether they'd be ready to come out in the house and work in some sort of a factory, they said that they would do that. This shows that the purdah and housewife ideology, although fully internalized, has some cracks, because it's being confronted with several contradictory realities. It is only by understanding the contradictions inherent in women's location within various structures that effective political action and challenges can be devised. Me's study goes a long way towards offering an analysis. Whilst there are now increasing numbers of Western feminist writings in this tradition, there is an unfortunate large block of writing which succumbs to cultural reductionism discussed earlier. Western feminist methodological universalisms or women's oppression is a global phenomenon. Western feminist writings on women in the third world subscribe to a variety of methodologies to demonstrate the universal cross-cultural operation of male dominance and female exploitation. I summarize and critique three such methods below, moving from the most simple to the most complex. Proof of universalism is provided through an arithmetic method. The argument is this: the more the number of women who wear the veil, the more universal is the sexual segregation and control of women. Similarly, a large number of different fragmented examples from a variety of countries also apparently add up to a universal fact. For instance, Muslim women in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, India and Egypt all wear a veil. Hence, this indicates that the sexual control of women is a universal fact in those countries in which within women are veiled. Fran Hoskin writes, rape, forced prostitution, polygamy, FGM, pornography, the beating of girls and women's, purdah, which is the segregation of women, are all violations of human rights. By equating purdah with rape, domestic violence and forced prostitution, she asserts that it's sexual control. and it functions as the primary explanation for purdah, whatever the context. The institution is thus denied a cultural and historical specificity, and contradictions and potential subversions of the institution are ruled out. These women are not given agency. In both these examples, the problem is not ascertaining that the practice of a veil is widespread. This assertion is made on the basis of numbers. It's descriptive. However, it's an analytical leap from the practice to an assertion that it is a general significance in controlling women and it must be questioned. Whilst there is a physical similarity in veils worn by women in Saudi Arabia and Iran, the specific meaning attached to this practice varies across to the cultural and ideological context. For example, as is well known, Iranian middle-class women veiled themselves during the 79 revolution to indicate solidarity with their veiled working-class sisters, whilst in contemporary Iran, mandatory Islamic laws dictate that women wear veils. Whilst in these instances similar reasons might be offered for the veil, opposition to the Shah and Western cultural colonization, and then true Islamicization of Iran, the concrete meanings attached to Iranian women wearing the veil are different in both historical contexts. In the first case, wearing the veil is an oppositional and revolutionary gesture on the part of Iranian... Adverts. Very annoying. Okay, wait. Only through such context-specific differentiated analysis does feminist theorizing and practice acquire significance. It's on the basis of such analyses that effective political strategies can be generated. To assume that the mere practice of veiling women in a number of Muslim countries indicates the universal oppression of women through sexual segregation, which would not be analytically and theoretically reductive, but also prove quite useless when it comes to political strategizing. Second, concepts like reproduction, the division of labor, family, marriage, household, patriarchy are used without their specification in local culture and historical context. Concepts are used by feminists in providing explanations for women's subordination, apparently assuming a universal applicability. For instance, how is it possible to refer to the sexual division of labor when the contents of this division changes from one environment to the next and one historical juncture to another? At its most abstract level, it is the fact of the differential assignation of tasks according to sex that's significant. However, this is quite different from the meaning or value that the content of this sexual division of labor assumes in different contexts. In most cases, the assigning of tasks on the basis of sex is an ideological origin. There is no question that a claim such as women are concentrated in service-orientated occupations in a large number of countries is descriptively valid. Descriptively, perhaps the existence of a similar sexual division of labour in a variety of different countries can be asserted. However, the concept of a sexual division of labour is more than just descriptive. It indicates the value placed on men's work versus women's work. The mere existence of a sexual division of labour is taken to be the proof of oppression in various societies. This results from a confusion between descriptive and explanatory, normative, moral, potentials for the concept of the sexual division of labour. Superficially similar situations may have been radically different. Historically specific explanations cannot be treated as identical. For instance, the rise of female-headed households in middle-class America might be constructed as a greater independence of feminist progress, whereas women are chosen single-parented. There are increasing numbers of lesbian mothers. However, the recent increase in female-headed households in Latin America, when women have more decision-making power, is concentrated amongst the poorest strata, where life choices are the most constrained economically. A similar argument can be made for the rise of female-headed families amongst Black and Chicana women in the US. The positive correlation between this and the level of poverty amongst women of colour and white working class women is now acquired in a name, the feminization of poverty. Thus, whilst it's possible to state that there's a rise in female-headed households, and in fact there is a rise in Latin America, this rise isn't a universal indicator of women's independence, nor can it be discussed as a universal indicator of women's impoverishment. The meaning and explanation for the rise varies according to the socio-historical context. Simply, the existence of a sexual division of labour in most contexts cannot be sufficient explanation for the universal subjugation of women in the workforce. The sexual division of labour does indicate a devaluation of women's work, and it must be shown through analysis of particular contexts. In addition, devaluation of women must be shown through careful analyses. Concepts like the sexual division of labour can be useful only if they are generated through local contextual analyses. If some such concepts are assumed to be universal, there is a homogenization of class, race, culture, and sexualities, genders, etc., and historical specificities of women that creates a false, in the third world, that creates a false sense of the commonality of oppressions, interests, and struggles against women globally. Beyond sisterhood, there is racism, colonialism, and imperialism. Finally, some writers confuse the use of gender as a subordinate category of organizing analyses with a universalistic proof and instantiation of this category. In other words, empirical studies of gender differences are confused with the analytical organization of cross-cultural work. Beverly Brown's review of the book Nature, Culture and Gender illustrates this point. Brown suggests that nature, culture, female and male are subordinate categories which organize and locate lesser categories. Wow, domestic, biological, technological, within their logic. These categories are universal in that they organize the universe in a system of representations. This relation is independent of universal substantiation of any particular category. Her critique hinges on the fact that rather than clarify the generalizability of nature, culture, female, male, subordinate organizational categories, the book construes the universality of a lie at the level of empirical truth, which can be investigated through fieldwork. Thus, the usefulness of the nature, culture, female, male, for formulation as a universal mode of organization of representation within any particular social historical system is lost. Here, methodological universalism is assumed on the basis of the reduction of the nature, culture, female, male, analytical categories, to demand for empirical proof of its existence. Study, research. Discourses of representation are confused with material realities, and the distinction between woman and woman is lost. Feminist work on women in the third world, which blurs this distinction, ends up constructing monolithic images of third world women as women who are defined as material subjects not through their materiality, but through their representation. To summarize, I've discussed 3 methodological moves identifiable in feminist and other academic cross-cultural work, which seeks to uncover a universality in women's subordinate position in society. The next and final section pulls together the previous sections and attempts to outline the effects of this Western feminist writing on women in the third world. These arguments are not against generalization as much as they are careful, historically specific, complex generalizations. Nor do these arguments deny the necessity of forming strategic political identities and affinities. Whilst Indian women of different religions, caste and class might forge a political unity on the basis of organising against police brutality towards women, an analysis of police brutality must be contextual. Strategic coalitions which construct oppositional political identities for themselves are based on generalisation, but the analyses of these groups cannot be based on universal ahistorical categories. The subjects of power. This last section returns to an earlier point about the inherently political nature of feminist scholarship and attempts to clarify my point about the possibility of detecting a colonialist move in the case of a hegemonic first to third world connection in scholarship. The 9 texts that I've discussed focus on common areas in women's status within societies: religion, family, kinship, legal system, sexual division of labour, education, and political resistance. A large number of Western feminists writing on women in the Third World focus on these themes. Of course, the texts have varying emphases. For instance, 2 studied women in Palestine and Indian women focus on female militancy and political involvement, while women in Arab societies deal with Arab women's legal, religious, and familial status. In addition, each text evidences a variety of methodologies and degrees of care in making generalizations. Interestingly, however, almost all the texts assume women as a category of analysis. Each text assumes women are a group identity, with the different cultures discussed prior to their entry into social relations. Thus, Omved can talk about Indian women whilst referring to a particular group of women in the state of Maharashtra, Cutrufeli about women of Africa, and Mintzes about Arab women, as if these cultures and groups of women have some sort of obvious coherence distinct from men. The status or position of women is assumed to be self-evident because women are constructed as a group and placed within religious, economic, familial, and legal structures. However, this focus on the position of women, where women is seen as coherent groups in all contexts regardless of class, ethnicity, structures in the world in a binary, dichotomous term, where women are seen in opposition to men. Patriarchy is always necessarily male dominance, and the religious, legal, economic, and familial systems are implicitly assumed to be constructed by men. Thus, women and men are constituted as whole populations, and relations of dominance and exploitation are posited in terms of whole people, wholes coming into exploitative relations. It is only when men and women are seen as different categories or groups possessing different and already constituted categories of experience, cognition, and interests that such a dichotomy is possible. What does this imply about the structure and functioning of power relations? The setting up of the commonality of Third World women's struggles across classes and cultures against a general notion of oppression. What Foucault calls the juridico-discursive model of power, the principal feature in which there is negative relations and an insistence on the rule, which forms a binary system, a cycle of prohibition, a logic and a uniformity of the apparatus functioning at different levels. Feminist discourse on the Third World, which assumes a homogeneous category, a group called women, operates through the setting up of an ordinary power divisions. Power relations are structures in terms of a source of power and a cumulative reaction to power. Opposition is a generalized phenomenon created as a response to power, which in turn is possessed by certain groups. The major problem with the definition of power is that it locks all revolutionary struggles into binary structures, possessing power versus being powerless. Women are powerless, unified groups. If the struggle for a just society is to be seen in terms of the move from powerless to powerful, this is the implication of feminist discourse, which structures sexual differences in terms of the division between sexes, and the new society would be structurally identical to existing power relations, constituting itself as an inversion of what exists. If relations of domination and exploitation are defined in terms of binary divisions, groups which dominate and groups which are dominated, surely the implication is that ascensions of power of women as a group is sufficient to dismantle the existing organization of presumably patriarchal power relationships. But women as a group are not, in some sense, essentially superior or infallible. The crux of the problem lies in the internal assumption of women as a homogenous group or category, oppressed, a familiar assumption of Western radical and liberal feminists. What happens when this assumption of women as an oppressed group is situated in the context of writing about the Third World women? It is here that I locate the colonists' move. By focusing on the representation of women in the Third World and what I refer to as Western feminists and self-preservation in the same context, it seems evident that Western feminists alone become the true subjects of counter-history. Third World women, on the other hand, never rise above generality and object status. Whilst radical and liberal feminist assumptions of women as sexual class might elucidate inadequately the autonomy of women's struggles in the West, the assumption of the notion of women as a homogeneous category to women in the Third World colonizes and appropriates the polarities and locations of different groups in different social, economic, and ethnic frameworks. Many Z-Press authors who ground themselves in the strategies of Marxism implicitly create a unity of women by substituting women's activity for labour as the primary theoretical determinant of women's situations. Here again, women are constituted as a coherent group not on the basis of natural qualities but on the basis of a sociological unity of their role in domestic production and wage labour. In other words, Western feminist discourse, by assuming women as a coherent, already a priori constituted group, which places in kinship, legal and other structures, defines women as subjects outside of social relations, instead of looking at how women are constituted as women through these structures. Legal, economic, religious, and familial structures are treated as phenomena to be judged by Western standards. It is here that ethnocentric universalities come into play. When these structures are defined as underdeveloped or developing, women are placed within structures with an explicit image of average Third World woman that's produced. This is the transformation of the implicitly Western oppressed women into the oppressed Third World women. Whilst the category of oppressed women is generated through an exclusive focus on gender difference, the oppressed Third World women category has an additional attribute to Third World difference. The Third World difference includes paternalistic attitudes towards women in the Third World. Since discussions of the various themes, kinship, education, religion, are conducted in the context of a underdevelopment of the Third World, which is nothing less than unjustifiably confusing development with a separate path taken in the West and ignoring the direction of a first to Third World power relationship. Third World women as a group or category are automatically and necessarily defined as religious, not progressive, family-orientated, traditional, legal minors, they're still not conscious of their own rights, illiterate, ignorant, domestic, backwards, and sometimes revolutionary because their country is in a state of war they must fight. This is how the Third World difference is produced. When the category of sexually oppressed women is located within particular systems of the Third World, which are defined on a scale which is normed through Eurocentric assumptions, not only are Third World women defined in a particular way prior to their entry into social relations, but since there is no connection made between First and Third World power shifts, it reinforces an assumption that people have, that the Third World is not as evolved to the extent that the West is. This mode of feminist analysis, by homogenizing and systemizing the experiences of different groups of women in these countries, erases all marginal and resistant modes of experiences. It is significant that none of the text focuses on lesbian politics or the politics of ethnic and religious marginal groups in Third World politics. Resistance can thus only be defined as a reactive, not as something inherent or an operation of power. If power, as Foucault has argued, can really be understood in the context of resistance, this misconceptualization of power is analytically as well as strategically problematic. It limits theoretical analysis as well as reinforcing Western cultural imperialism. For in the context of a first and third world balance of power, feminist analyses which perpetrate and sustain the hegemony of the idea of the superiority of the West produce a corresponding set of universal images of the third world woman. Images like the veiled woman, the powerful mother, the chaste virgin, the obedient wife, the systemically oppressed lesbian. These images exist in universal ahistorical splendor, setting in motion a colonialist discourse which exercises a specific power in defining, coding and maintaining first to third world connections. To conclude then, let me suggest some similarities between the authorizing signature of Western feminist writings of women and the signature of projects on humanism in general. Humanism as a Western ideology and political project, which involves the necessary recuperation of Eastern women. Many thinkers like Foucault, Derrida, Kristeva, Deleuze, and Said have written at length about underlying anthropomorphism and ethnocentrism, which constitutes a hegemonic humanistic problematic that repeatedly confirms and legitimizes man's centrality. Gosh, that was a dense sentence. Feminist theorists like Irigaray, Kaufman, and Sixou and others have written about the recuperation and absence of women within Western humanism. The focus of the work of all these thinkers is stated simply as an uncovering of the political interests that underlie a binary logic of humanist discourse and ideology, whereby, as a valuable recent essay puts it, the first term, which is secondary and derivative, is privileged over and colonizes the second term, which is in fact primary and originative. In other words, insofar as woman, and East are defined as others or the peripheral, and Western man is humanism that can represent himself is within the center. It is not the center that determines the periphery, but the periphery that in its boundedness determines the center. Just as feminists like Kristeva, Sixou, and others deconstruct the latent anthropomorphism in Western discourse, I've suggested a parallel strategy in this paper to uncover a latent ethnocentrism, in particular feminist writings on women from the third world. As discussed earlier, a comparison between Western feminist self-presentation and Western feminist representation of women in the third world has significant results. Universal images of the third world woman, veiled woman, chaste, images constructed from third world difference to sexual differences, are predicated upon assumptions about Western women as secular, liberated, and having control over their own lives. This is not to suggest that Western women are secular, liberated, and have control over their own lives. I'm referring to a discursive self-presentation and not necessarily to material reality. If this was a material reality, there would be no need for political movements in the West. A ridiculous contention to those days of imperialist adventures of Indiana Jones. Similarly, only from the vantage point of the West is it possible to define the third world as underdeveloped and economically dependent. Without the overdetermined discourse that creates the third world, there would be no first world. Without the third world woman, the particular self-preservation of Western women would be problematic. I'm suggesting that the one enables and sustains the other. This is not to say that the signature of Western feminist writings have the same authority as the project of Western humanism. However, in the context of the hegemony of Western scholarly establishment in the production and dissemination of texts, and in the context of the legitimating imperative of humanistic and scientific discourse, the definition of third world woman as a monolith might tie into the larger economic and ideological praxis of disinterested scientific inquiry and pluralism, which are at the surface manifestations of a latent economic and cultural colonization of the non-Western world. It is time to move beyond the Marks who found it possible to say they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. In short, do your work and acknowledge and listen, because women and people of all different genders can represent and explain themselves.